Hello again, 102. In this particular video, we will go over some of the strategies of President Nixon to end the Vietnam War, and we'll briefly talk about this world order that is beginning to emerge in the 1970s. And by the time Nixon entered the White House in January 1969, he and Henry Kissinger had developed a comprehensive vision of a new world order. The result of their collaboration was a dramatic transformation of U.S. foreign policy. Since 1945, the United States had lost its monopoly on nuclear weapons, its overwhelming economic dominance, and much of its geopolitical influence. The rapid rise of competing power centers in Europe, China, and Japan complicated the Cold War as well as international relations in general. And also because the Cold War will change in the 70s with the beginning of détente, or the thaw in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. They will attempt to reduce arms, but by the end of the decade, that's going to go away again with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And the immediate task, and as the Vietnam War was winding down, détente is going on as well in 1972 and 1973. And it'll culminate with the Soviet Soyuz hookup in space between the cosmonauts and the astronauts. And then after that, in the late 70s, relations begin to fall apart. The immediate task is to end the war in Vietnam, which one presidential aide called a bone in the nation's throat. And until the war ended and all the troops had returned home, the social harmony that President Nixon had promised will remain elusive. Privately, he had decided there was no way to win the war in Vietnam. So instead, he sought what he called peace with honor. And there will be a gradual withdrawal. And the Vietnam policy by Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, moved along three fronts. First, U.S. negotiators in Paris demanded the withdrawal of Viet Cong forces from South Vietnam and the preservation of the United States-backed government of President Nguyen Van Tho. On the second front, Nixon tried to quell the domestic unrest. He labeled the anti-war movement a brotherhood of the misguided, the mistaken, the well-meaning, and the malevolent. He sought to diffuse the anti-war movement by steadily reducing the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam, justifying the reduction as the natural result of Vietnamization, the equipping and training of South Vietnamese soldiers and pilots to assume the burden of combat. From a peak of 560,000 troops in 1969, U.S. combat forces returned home at a steady pace, and by 1973, only 50,000 troops remained in Vietnam. And again, Vietnamization defined, this is the Nixon-era policy of equipping and training South Vietnamese forces to take over the burden of combat from the U.S. And in 1969, Nixon also established a draft lottery, whereby the birth dates of 19-year-old men were randomly selected and assigned a number between 1 and 366 in order of their selection. Those with low lottery numbers from 1 to 160 would be the first drafted into the military service. And 4 years later, in 1973, the president ended the draft altogether by creating an all-volunteer military. Those initiatives, coupled with troop withdrawals from Vietnam, diffused for a time the anti-war movement. Opinion polls showed strong public support for Nixon's policies related to the Vietnam War. On the third front, while steadily reducing the number of U.S. combat troops in Southeast Asia, Nixon and Kissinger greatly expanded the U.S. bombing of North Vietnam in the hopes of pressuring the communist leaders to end the war. Kissinger felt that a fourth-rate power like North Vietnam must have a breaking point at which it would decide it was suffering too much damage. Nixon agreed, suggesting that they let the North Vietnamese leaders know that he was so obsessed about communism that he might use the nuclear button if necessary. He's totally bluffing on that. Still, Hanoi's leaders did not flinch. They decided to let Nixon's domestic critics undermine his presidency. Then on April the 30th, 1970, Nixon announced an incursion into neutral Cambodia by U.S. troops to clean out hidden Vietnamese communist military bases. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through Cambodia, and that's how they supplied the VC in the South. And this reignites divisions at home. And there's escalation of anti-war riots over the invasion of Cambodia. And in the spring of 1970, the news of the secret Cambodian incursion by United States forces set off explosive protests on college campuses across the nation. In Ohio, the governor sent the National Guard to Kent State University to control campus rioting. The poorly trained guardsmen panicked, and they're about the same age as the people that they're pointing guns at. And they opened fire on the rock-throwing demonstrators, killing 4 student bystanders. And this is cut off a little bit. This is the photo of the Kent State shooting. And Marianne Vecchio was a teenage runaway who was participating in the anti-war demonstration. And 4 students were killed. And many Americans, many of the silent majority, will say that these protesters got what they deserved. But singer Neil Young had a different view. Tin soldiers and Nixon's coming. We're finally on our own. This summer, I hear the drumming. 4 dead in Ohio. And the Ohio governor banned radio stations from playing the song, which only made it more popular. And then the Pentagon Papers were published. And in June of '71, the New York Times began publishing excerpts from the history of United States decision-making in Vietnam policy. And this was a secret Defense Department study commissioned by Robert McNamara before his resignation as Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense in 1968. And the so-called Pentagon Papers, leaked to the press by Daniel Ellsberg, a former Marine and thereafter a Defense Department official, confirmed what many critics of the war had long suspected. The Congress and the public had not received the full story on the Gulf of Tonkin incident of 1964. Plans for United States entry into the war were being drawn up even as President Johnson was promising that combat troops would never be sent to Vietnam. Although the Pentagon Papers dealt with events only up to 1965, the Nixon administration blocked their publication, arguing that release of the classified information would endanger national security and would prolong the war. And by a vote of 6-3, the Supreme Court ruled against the government, and newspapers throughout the country began publishing the controversial documents the next day. And this will culminate in the Watergate crisis, ladies and gentlemen. Because of the releasing of these documents, the Nixon administration believed the Democratic Party was behind this, and they will then attempt to bug the Democratic National Committee offices in the Watergate Hotel. More on that in another coming video. And it's war without end. During 1972, mounting social divisions at home and the approach of the presidential election influenced negotiations in Paris between the United States and representatives of North Vietnam. On October 26, only a week before the United States presidential election, a jubilant Kissinger announced that peace was at hand. But as it turned out, this was a cynical ploy to win votes for Nixon's re-election bid. Several days earlier, the Tho regime in South Vietnam had rejected the Kissinger plan for a ceasefire, fearful that allowing North Vietnamese troops to remain would virtually guarantee a communist victory. And then the Christmas bombings of North Vietnam began at the end of 1972. 36,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Hanoi and other cities. Yet the bombings also made the North Vietnamese more willing to negotiate, and the airstrikes stopped on December 29th, and the talks in Paris soon resumed. A month later, on January 27, 1973, the United States, North and South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed an agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam, known as the Paris Peace Accords. In fact, however, the Accords represented a carefully disguised United States surrender that enabled Nixon to end the nation's combat role. While Nixon and Kissinger claimed that the bombings had brought North Vietnam to its senses. In truth, the North Vietnamese never altered their basic stance. They have been doing the same thing since the end of the Second World War. They kept 150,000 troops in South Vietnam, and they remained committed to the reunification of Vietnam under one government. And now the collapse of South Vietnam will come about. On March 29, 1973, the last U.S. combat troops left Vietnam, and within months of the U.S. withdrawal, the war between the North and South resumed. And in 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a full-scale invasion, and President Tho will leave Vietnam and fly to Taiwan with 3.5 tons of gold. And on April 30th, 1975, Americans watched on television as North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, soon to be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. And the military helicopters lifted desperate United States Embassy and South Vietnamese officials and their families to warships offshore. And this was a hellish time to be in Saigon. Many people will evacuate and attempt to get out of South Vietnam. More on that in a moment. North Vietnam absorbed incredible losses, some 600,000 soldiers and countless civilians killed. South Vietnam lost 240,000 soldiers, and over 500,000 Vietnamese became refugees in the United States. More than 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. 300,000 were wounded, and 2,500 were declared missing, MIA. And almost 100,000 returned, missing one or more limbs. The United States spent $158 billion on the Vietnam War.